Hey guys. So, as we talk about chapter 24, it's a good idea to start off with an understanding of what the average American family is spending their money on. So, we start out with housing, and housing is going to eat up the biggest chunk of the budget. This also includes utility costs. And, you're looking at increases in that area will have a bigger impact on the family budget than something like apparel. On the other hand, you have to understand that this is the average family, so different demographics would pay more for medical care, and so if there's increases in medical care, that would affect the elderly to a greater degree. When you're looking at the consumer price index, you're understanding why we're doing this, and because we're looking at consumers and what are consumers spending their money on. That's different than businesses or the overall government. It's also very important to know this because we have different contracts are based off of this number. We have Social Security is the biggest one, and every year there's a cost of living adjustment for Social Security, and so seniors get more money every year, but it's based on what the government says the consumer price index was, or the cost of living and how that changed. So this is how the CPI is calculated. Number one, the BLS fixes the basket. They decide what is the average American family buying every month. We would have a cell phone plan. We'd have so many gallons of milk, so many apples, so many shirts, and all those things go into the basket. Then they find the prices of those items by actually going to the store, and they compute the basket's cost. Then we're doing a calculation. And so this is the first one. We're looking at the CPI. So in the base year, and in America, the base year is 1982 to 1984. It's an average of those prices. In the base year, this number would be 100. So you have the cost of a basket in a given year, and then you have the cost of the basket in the base year. And so you get 100 for the base year. And then in subsequent years, that number has climbed well above 100. So now, you get into two and 300 for your CPI number. And then you compute the inflation rate. So you take a look at the inflation rate, CPI this year, CPI last year, and then you put it over last year. So it's new minus original over original. Keep in mind that where it says CPI last year, sometimes that is the base year. Usually you'll be told exactly what the inflation rate is that they're looking for. So if you have to compute it from one year to the next year, it's a pretty standard calculation, just percent change. As a quick example, let's say this is our basket, four pizzas and 10 lattes. And so you could see, as opposed to GDP, sometimes your basket is just a sentence up at the top of the problem. Then you compute the cost of your basket in each year, 2010 to 2012. And then you can compute your CPI in each year using 2010 as the base year. So note that the base year is fixed. And since the base year is fixed, we're putting everything over 60 because these items cost $60 in the base year. And then if you're asked to, you compute the inflation rate. And so if you're computing it year to year, you go 15% the first year and then 13% the next year. You'll notice that's different than just saying 30% because you're doing a year over year. In this case, it's going to be a little bit less. There are some problems with CPI, so those are important to understand. One of them, and you started looking at this yesterday, is substitution bias. Prices don't all rise at the same rate. And so consumer goes into the store and they see that one month hamburgers are different than hot dogs, or maybe even one week. And so if prices have changed from one week to the next, a consumer might substitute. And, consumers are fairly flexible on a lot of things in terms of what they buy. So if there's really big price increases for one product, they simply might substitute another one. And the CPI might not reflect this. I mean, this is not something the government gets to compute every single day. So if prices are rising at different rates, and that's true now, consumers might substitute. And so the CPI calculation might be higher than what's actually happening because people will substitute to the lowest price item. Another problem with CPI is the introduction of new goods. It's tough to calculate as we have all this new technology what it would have cost in 1982. And so the CPI basket is fixed, but all these new goods that we get add a variety in there, and it's difficult to calculate that. um, it's also difficult to keep up with that. And when do you put the first iPhone in the CPI basket? That's a difficult decision to make. Another problem with CPI is unmeasured quality change. So the quality of the goods will change over time. The BLS does try to account for this, but it is difficult to do different quality items. And if your shirts are better quality, they might be more expensive, but if it's better quality, it might last longer. So it's difficult to understand how often we're buying things and what happens when we buy things that we're expecting to last for a longer time. So, there are a couple of different kinds of inflation you need to know about, and so just be aware of these terms. These terms are not used in your book, but they are used on the AP exam. So, demand pull inflation is the kind of inflation that happens when you have too many dollars chasing too few goods. We're seeing a lot of this right now. So, it's an increase in demand. People are spending money. And since they're spending money, supply isn't keeping up. It was unexpected, and so we're getting demand pull inflation. Demand is being pulled up, and so we have an overheated economy. We're seeing this right now. We have excessive spending, but we have about the same amount of goods. So we're getting a lot of demand pull inflation right now. The other kind of inflation that, interestingly enough, we're also seeing is we're seeing higher production costs. And so you could have cost push inflation. Cost push inflation happens when you have a negative supply shock, could increase the cost of production. And usually this is. Shocks to the system, but over time we are seeing higher labor costs, so there is some cost push inflation going on in the economy right now. So if you want a little bit more practice, we have this right here. We're just looking at 10 pounds of beef, 20 pounds of chicken. We have 3 years. You compute the CPI in 2011, be able to compute the inflation rate from 2011 to 2012. Notice that when we're looking at the CPI basket of 120 in 2010, that's the base year, but it doesn't have to be. It could be named 2011 as the base year. But in this problem, we're using 2010 as the base year. So compute CPI in 2011 and what's the inflation rate. So hopefully you did this correctly. CPI 2011, you're looking at 150. And so CPI in 2011, you had the basket of 150. The basket cost 120 in 2010. So you get a CPI number of 125. Your inflation rate, if you're looking at 2011 to 2012, you compute the basket in 2012, and you're looking at 175 as your CPI in 2012. So you're looking at 40% as your inflation rate. So be aware of the differences between the GDP deflator and the CPI. There are some significant ones, and some things are included in one but not the other. So, important to note that capital goods are excluded from your consumer price index, but they are included in your GDP deflator. Um, and that's important because consumers aren't buying capital goods. So, if there's increases in that, it's not going to impact consumers as much. Also, note that the CPI uses a fixed basket, but the GDP deflator is fluctuating year to year. So that could be good and could be kind of a benefit for the GDP deflator because it's a more up to date measure. So just be aware that there are some differences between what the consumers are buying and what the overall economy might be doing. You're not going to calculate a cost of a submarine in the CPI. That said, the inflation measures do, for the most part, match. Pretty close. Not exactly, but they're pretty close. So you're looking at CPI is what we usually use, but the GDP deflator is a fairly accurate measure too of inflation. And in this case, just you could take a look at some quick examples. If Starbucks raises the price of frappuccinos, Caterpillar raises the price of industrial tractors, and Armani raises the price of Italian jeans it sells in the US, how these would affect CPI and GDP. So in A, they would both rise. In B, GDP deflator rises, but CPI does not. And in C, we're looking at a rise in CPI because consumers are spending on that, but GDP deflator does not. This is one more formula that you're going to need to have written down. And it's important to note that inflation would be makes it difficult to compare dollar amounts over different time periods. Minimum wage is a common example of this. And so you're looking at minimum wage at two different time periods. And you're saying, okay, is minimum wage keeping up with inflation? And in fact, it's still, amazingly enough, 7.25 at the federal level. So can you buy the same amount of things in 1964 that you could in either 2010 or 2020? And so we have a different formula. It's kind of flip CPI around a little bit. We can use CPI to convert 1964, this 1964 figure into today's dollars. So just write down this equation. You could pause for a second, but we're looking at something priced in today's dollars. And then you're looking at what it cost in year T. And then you use the CPI. What was the price level today? And you put it over the price level in year T. So if minimum wage was $1.15 in year T the CPI was 31.3, and in 2010 it was 220. So you put that into the equation, and you say the minimum wage in 1964 was $8.09 in 2010 dollars. So that means that the 725 that it was in 2010 is less historically than minimum wage should have been. And we're all set. So move on to the next activity. Thanks very much.